The food movement kept circling around aesthetics, ethics, and identity while leaving land ownership and labor relations mostly untouched.
This is Adam Kahlo, and welcome to It All Comes Back to Land, a Landscapes miniseries. This is the start of something a little different for the podcast. Instead of the usual one-off interviews, I wanted to sit with a single idea long enough to really interrogate it, and maybe even make it a little uncomfortable. In academic food system spaces, there is a lot of talk about transition and transformation. These are big words with big diagrams, but very small in terms of farmers in the room. You go to these conferences and someone is earnestly describing systems change. And you're thinking, that's great, but where are the people whose boots are actually muddy? This miniseries is an attempt to close that gap, and that means that I can't do it alone. So I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Mai Nguyen. Mai is a farmer activist in California, growing heirloom grains on 150 acres in Sonoma County using agroecological practices and non-commodity economics. They work with local bakeries, run flour shares, and are quietly rebuilding a regional grain economy. But Mai is also deeply political. They've helped shape California agricultural policy, worked on food access, democratic ownership, farmer organizing, and land reform, all with racial equity as the through line, and is nationally recognized for their work, like receiving a James Beard Leadership Award. Mai has been a trusted reality check for my research ideas over the years, which is an academic code for politely telling me when I'm wrong. The premise of this series is simple. If we care about food, we need to care a lot more about land. Who owns it, how they got it, how it's governed, and what that means for the rest of the system. Mai, I am really glad that you're here.
Hey, Adam. I'm always down for doing things differently and maybe making it uncomfortable.
Well, I first saw you speak when I was deep in my PhD studying young and beginning farmers in California. You were on this panel at the Berkeley campus, and I remember thinking, here's someone with their hands literally in the dirt and their heads fully in politics. That combination is rare.
Yeah, I hope you didn't actually look at my hands that were actually dirty. But yeah, that panel was an experience. It was my first year running my own farm. I was a beginning farmer on 5 acres of leased land, using draft horses to get out of the fossil fuel economy and planting heirloom, non-patented seeds to resist corporate seed control, and entirely on rainfall during the driest year in California's recorded history to make it harder for myself. Just some, hardcore values forward farming. You remember the rest of the panel?
I don't, not at this moment, but I do remember mostly keying in on what you were saying. I was preparing a question for you afterwards, and then I got nervous because it's pretty easy to impress academics, but I felt like a farmer activist would see right through me.
Yeah, but still we're here. So, but yeah, refresh. There was a fifth generation farmer from one of the largest landholding families in the state. And then this pistachio baron whose nuts are in like Costco and luxury hotels. And a second generation CSA farmer who like went to fancy business school and had that polish. And there was me. So it was all white guys in crisp button ups, and then me in a holy free pile Southwest print shirt.
I think this is coming back to me a little bit. So this was in that new shiny biosciences building, right?
Yeah, yeah. Temple of Sustainability, TM.
So I can picture it more now that at the event. I remember being horrified about how confidently sustainability was being framed as simply efficiency. And there was no concern for labor or, what was happening on the ground. And in my naivete, I thought that, even in the biosciences building, kind of we had moved way past that surface level argument.
Yeah, yeah. When you bring up labor, I remember I mentioned farm worker rights and child labor, and one guy practically like lunged at the mic to yell, "We do not use child labor!" Like fully unprompted twice. So. apparently I touched a nerve, and you and I became friends.
I was desperate to see a vision of sustainability, sustainable farming, where the workers were being trucked around in buses, and how good clean the buses were, well, wasn't the standard. Because I think that moment for me really captures what we can accomplish in this series. Because I think we should start really zoomed out. What is your vision for agriculture? You're my trusted source here. In contrast to that efficiency equals sustainability, that productivist status quo.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I what I envision is humanized agriculture, which, sounds obvious until you realize how inhuman our current system is. And humanized agriculture centers, the well-being at every step, planning, production, processing, distribution, seed saving, for all humans, past, present, and future. And right now, agriculture is driven by profit logics that stole labor and knowledge from the past. It exploits workers and damages our health in the present, and degrades ecosystems for future generations. So, if we're going to humanize agriculture that accounts for the past, we need repair, saving seeds while honoring the land-based knowledge of the people who carry that knowledge and the traditions, compensating them for it, ensuring that they thrive, their cultures thrive. For the present, agriculture as a living process, not an extractive one, is something we really need to embody, and to have diverse farms for a diverse society and real democracy in who gets land and decision-making power. As for the future, we need land reparations because knowledge, people, and food all need somewhere to root down. Yeah, humanizing agriculture.
Given these values, though, it's clear that you care about climate, justice, root cause analysis. Why farming? I mean, honestly, why do you keep doing this especially when the deck is so stacked against alternative farmers like you? Why not cop out like me and study the food system from 30,000 feet?
Really glad you're asking me at this time of year because I'm much more optimistic about farming. Ask me in like August, September. I'm like, yeah, why am I doing this? But ultimately, what I remind myself of is that, because land is where it starts and ends. We're made of it. We return to it. And that might sound like a little woo, spent a little too much time in West County, Sonoma, but it really is just chemistry. We are made of what came from the dirt. We're made of food. That's food, yo. So there's that. But yeah, I think if I were to think about this more seriously, yeah, I was raised Mahayana Buddhist in a Vietnamese refugee community, and ending suffering through simultaneous self-cultivation and helping others toward collective liberation, wasn't an abstract philosophy. It was our daily life. People were always finding ways to be useful to one another, how to repair what had been broken by war, displacement, and poverty. So I grew up with this constant question in the background of where can I be helpful? And as I got older, that question really sharpened. Climate change and inequality felt like the clearest sources of suffering in our time. And so I wanted to meet them head on. I trained as a climate scientist, first modeling data and then collecting it in the field. And while that work matters, for me, just measuring the fire while it burns didn't feel like enough. And then so I jumped to the other side, working in disaster management and refugee camps in Southeast Asia, cleaning up after climate change exacerbated disasters and helping people who were already the most disempowered. And it felt like that work was really essential, important, but it still felt reactive and just not where I was the most useful. So when I came back to the community I grew up in San Diego, California, I started working on food security and refugee resettlement, really in the refugee community that I was part of. And over, people told us the same thing. We want to grow our own food. And many of these people couldn't speak English very well or yet. And their credentials didn't transfer, but they could grow their food and medicine. And that, really hit home for me. I was born here, but so much was unfamiliar for my parents. And recognizing that for them to be able to come home from long days of working multiple jobs, but eating, Vietnamese food, that was its own kind of refuge. And like food was continuity, food was dignity, food soothed their souls. So when I ran a farmer's market in the neighborhood I grew up in, like the longest lines, like hours before opening, were always for Southeast Asian crops. Those vendors sold out first every time. That's when it clicked for me that farming wasn't just about production. It was about this, cultural survival and healing and power. So I wanted to grow organic Vietnamese crops, and I started learning how to farm with some detours into grad school and opening a farm to table eatery. But, climate change was always the through line. And I wanted to reduce food miles and like grow a full diet. And that's how like grains entered the picture. I realized a huge part of my own diet, staple grains, was completely missing from our food shed. So I started growing wheat, barley, and rye, and heirloom grains adapted to our changing climate, grown with rain-fed water, carbon capturing practices, and using a fraction of the water that commodity grain uses. And then stone milling it as whole wheat, getting it out to people through direct relationships. I get to hear from people that it's the first time that they've tasted wheat. And I love that, not just because of the flavor, but because it really opens a door, right? When people realize, like, I've never actually tasted wheat, what else am I missing? It helps people feel, they realize that they've been denied something. And then it starts to get them to think and imagine what else might be possible. But then I was hit by a semi truck. Yeah. And boom, couldn't grow vegetables anymore. But I could keep growing grains because it has a long maturation period and there's less daily physical activity. So I didn't plan to become what people now call me, which is grain queen. But I continue to work on increasing heirloom grain seed that isn't owned by chemical companies, seeds that we can save and share.
Listening to the story about grains in particular, my is really hitting me because in a previous episode of the podcast, I was interviewing someone who really believes in intensifying production as the main sustainability. And I even posed this question to them about imagine a grain farmer who is growing really intensive yields and they want to do something different. They want to grow something more heritage and they may reduce, yields a little bit. I asked them, in your view, that person is actually harming the climate because they think yields are going to need to be made up somewhere else in the world. It's going to cut down a forest. But to hear that contrasted to your story, how do you feel about this idea that, oh, because you might have a slightly less yields, your vision of grain production is actually, harming the climate?
And is their idea like if you're already going to be producing land, you may as well, or producing food, you may as well produce as much as possible. Otherwise, it's an injustice to having used that space.
Yeah, I mean, they don't usually use such terms as justice, probably too much social science there, but it's more that if you're not maximizing that efficiency through the market, there will be a price signal somewhere else that someone else is going to have to make it up, and then that means a forest somewhere else is going to be cut down. And so that's your bad that you're not maximizing the yields on the land.
Oh yeah, fascinating. I mean, they might be really offended that I actually intercrop with, nitrogen fixing plants and also pollinators that then feed non-humans. And so of what I harvest, it's even less because I dedicated space to plants that are not going to market, that are just going to be for turning under and for building up soil and maintaining a healthy ecology. In the context of knowing that we've lost 96% of our seed diversity in the last century, even though that diversity is what allowed us to survive in the first place, committing myself to growing up these rare heirloom grains from all over the world so that people can have a taste of home is really gratifying, and that I'm part of this lineage of seed savers over the past 14,000 years, some of these varieties being that old, right? That, I'm just a link in the continuum so that we can have another 14,000 years of eating these grains. So yeah, I'm keeping on because I know I'm a part of something bigger. I know that people will continue to eat something that is nourishing and comforting. And also knowing that like there's less than 2% of Americans are farmers. Someone has to do this work because 100% of people eat. And yeah, and farming just gives people like an embodied way to remember what it feels like to be alive with awe, humility, surprise, and snacks. Snacks.
Your relation to farming has these elements, some of them, listening to your story, grit, self-sufficiency, salt of the earth determination. I admire all of these, but I also admit it does remind me a little bit of this romanticized yeoman farmer mythology that captures a lot of the imagination of the good food movement. But what is impressive to me is that you buck this trend, thankfully, and you think always beyond, like you just said, beyond the land you work, not just in the fences, not just for yields, and you think to the system that you are also tied up in, along with all of us. What is some of the policy work that you have been doing to make sure that farming is more than just the practices of growing food?
My first real entry into policy was helping pass the 2017 Farmer Equity Act, California's first agricultural civil rights bill, as they refer to it. And what it did was it created a state definition for farmers of color, and that opens the door for being able to allocate resources for farmers of color, include farmers of color in shaping research, policy, and then also this Farmer Equity Act created a position within the Secretary of Agriculture's cabinet or staff to have a farmer equity officer. So that work, made something very clear to me, which is that farmers of color are deeply shaped by policy, but are rarely positioned to shape it. So from there, I focused on organizing farmers to participate directly in policy making and governance. And I conducted research for the 2019 California Young Farmer Report, which was kind of the first study of its kind to document the experiences of California's racially and culturally diverse farm owner operators. And I'll say in public what I say in private. Thank you, Adam, for your brilliant policy recommendations. But yeah, so with that Farmer Equity Act and the report and ongoing advocacy, those have all led to increased resources for farmers of color, as well as the development of a land equity task force and even a state-funded land purchases for Black farmers. So at the same time, I've been working on income and land security for farmers. I'm co-coordinating a campaign called the Essentials for Essential Workers campaign, so that we can get a guaranteed basic income for California farmers, as climate extremes and new health risks make farming increasingly precarious. And then on another policy front, I also co-founded Minnow, an organization focused on farmland tenure for California's farmers of color while advancing Indigenous sovereignty. And through Minnow, led by Neil Thopper and in partnership with First Nations Development Institute, as well as several tribes, we helped pass precedent-setting legislation that returned land from the state of California to Indigenous tribes for the first time. So, alongside that, I supported farmers in creating cooperative structures so they could own land and businesses together democratically. Yeah, all those policies at the state level have given me greater insight into the mechanics of our institutions. But I also think it's important to say that not all policy lives in legislation, and how people decide together, how power, labor, and ownership are structured, that's policy too. Like I develop cooperative enterprises in the form of farmers pooling resources to access new markets as an agricultural cooperative, or farm workers owning a farm together as a worker cooperative farm. These cooperatives give farmers and anyone a way to practice democracy in their daily lives and not just advocate for it from the outside. So it's a powerful way of bringing people from different backgrounds, different races, religions, economic class together for a practical common cause. And the agreements we make, those are policies. And so, yeah, all of this policy work with what our dear friend Nina Ichikawa would say is the work of institutionalizing our social movements, is really about creating the conditions for agroecological farming, social justice, and collective liberation so that it's possible and can endure.
Yeah, I mean, so this resume, you are doing so many different types of labor in the food system. This is why I've always really valued your opinions. It raises a question though, which is you're doing all this different types of work, and still, if you go to a place like maybe the Bay Area or other kind of coastal cities, the food movement, it seems like it's successful, right? There are farmers markets everywhere. You got farm to table menus, all kinds of organic labels. You have climate smart, regen ag. But structurally, we know we're still in crisis, in the aggregate, right? Human food systems, they contribute up to one third of climate force emissions. They're a leading cause of poison in freshwater, destruction of marine habitats. It's the place where you're going to find modern day human slavery is in agriculture. And despite all that, through industrial farming, you still have conditions where globally 1 in 10 are hungry and over 15% obese. So, like, what went sideways with all of this effort to make the food system better?
Wow, that sounds real devastating when you put it that way. Well, I think a lot of well-intentioned energy got funneled into, like, consumer-facing solutions. We told ourselves that if people just knew better, they'd buy better, and that would fix things. And to be fair, awareness did change. People care more about food now than they did 30 or 40 years ago. That's real. But awareness alone doesn't redistribute land, power, or risk.
I mean, I got inspired by a lot of this food movement actors, and even through food, some of what you talked about, just through kind of gastronomy, through taste. So, would it be fair to say, hopefully, that the movement didn't fail, but it's just kind of aimed at the wrong levers?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we focused on choice instead of conditions, right? So like take local food. The idea was that shortening supply chains would make the system fairer and more sustainable. But local doesn't tell you who owns the land, who works it, who gets paid, or who bears the risk. Except for that handy GIS map that you made. Beyond that, which, we need more of that map, but you still have a deeply exploitative farm. You can still have a deeply exploitative farm 5 miles away.
A lot of my slogany tote bags, I won't be able to wear them anymore.
Yeah, sorry to the canvas industry. But yeah, I mean, the other part is, there's certification, organic, regenerative, biodynamic. These systems were supposed to be tools for accountability, but in practice, they often become new forms of gatekeeping, right? Like if you have land, capital, legal help, time for paperwork, branding expertise, certification can work for you. But if you're leasing year to year, farming multiple plots, juggling off farm work, um, it's out of reach. And even if your practices are excellent and even beyond what those certification standards are.
Something I get really frustrated with, especially being an American in Europe, where at least they still believe in kind of in good technocratic governance. There's so many certification schemes. They often call it schemes, but in a serious way. And it's in these certification schemes, the certification is the end goal. Once it's established and built up, then that's it. It's not the floor.
really like that. Let's just call them serious schemes. But yeah, it definitely becomes a market distinction instead of a public standard, right? Which means industrial agriculture can absorb it. And we saw this with organic. Big ag didn't fight organic, they diversified into it. As Julie Guthman writes in Agrarian Dreams, organic became a way for those large firms to straddle two markets at once, conventional and alternative, so maximizing profit without really changing who controls land or supply chains.
Sounds like you're describing regenerative agriculture right now.
Yeah. Yes. I want to be careful here. Practices that build soil and retain water and reduce chemicals matter, but we have to ask harder questions. Who can afford to implement these practices? Who has long-term land tenure to invest in them? Who has the time or resources to pay for someone else's time to complete the paperwork? And who gets held up as the face of regeneration? Like, I remember being at Expo West a few years ago when regenerative agriculture was first being heavily promoted by like General Mills and Patagonia. They even had like I don't know if it was a taxidermy bison or just like a fake bison. Anyways, they were really pushing regenerative agriculture, and the farmers showcased were, young white men who had inherited thousands of acres. Their families built wealth through conventional agriculture, often with public subsidies, and that accumulated capital is now what makes regeneration possible. So those practices aren't wrong, but they're not accessible to everybody.
In this way, I feel like regeneration risks just becoming a branding exercise that's layered, grafted on top of the same ownership structures. It's a way to turn this idea, which is crazy when you kind of think about it, of just owning the earth as legitimate. It becomes something that's common sense, and then it even becomes a moral good, like stewardship.
Yeah, and that's the pattern. Like the food movement kept circling around aesthetics, ethics, and identity while leaving land ownership and labor relations mostly untouched. Which is why I think we have to flip the script entirely. Instead of asking why ecological food hasn't taken over the market, we should ask, why is extraction still considered normal? Why do farmers have to pay to prove they didn't poison the land? Immigrant farmers ask me this all the time. Like, why do I need certification to say that I planted a seed and watered it? Right? Like, what if natural farming were just conventional? And if you want to use petrochemical fertilizers, heavy tillage, monocropping, labor extraction, you pay, right? A pay to pollute model. Like we already do this partially with pesticide licensing. So, we could expand it dramatically.
This really gets to the heart of it because the we feed the world through intensive agriculture. Right now, that has the moral high ground, or at least it has through kind of these green revolution narratives. What you're saying would invert the moral economy of agriculture.
Exactly. Yeah. Like right now, harm is subsidized and care is niche. Right? The costs of industrial farming are externalized onto farm workers, rural communities, public health systems, and future generations. But if we made extractive practices expensive, visible, and regulated, like really, really regulated, you'd see behavior change quickly, I think, especially in a sector that's so consumer facing. Labels like organic or regenerative can still exist. People will always signal values in a stratified society, but, labels can't be our only theory of change. Land is.
Before we get to that, what about consumers? What about the role of consumers? There is so much good food education now. Won't newly enlightened consumers get it out of this mess? Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, it lands in 2007 or about, and suddenly everyone is squinting at labels, they're asking questions at restaurants. And here, the theory is pretty simple. If people know where their food comes from, they'll make better choices. Markets are very powerful, we know this, and then the system will change in response.
I mean, that book absolutely cracked something open. It dislodged people from the idea that food was neutral, but it also handed us a moral framework without a political one. So instead of changing the system so it works for people, we asked individuals to solve structural problems with their shopping carts. Right? And that quickly turned into food as identity, food as virtue, food as social sorting mechanism. Not that we need another one, right? And suddenly it wasn't just junk food or food and junk food. It was good food and bad food, good eaters and bad eaters. And that moral pressure landed hardest on people with the least time, money, and choice. Like, let me tell you, farmers, we eat at Jack in the Box. Okay. And like almost 20 years later, we're hyper informed and deeply divided. People are optimizing diets, chasing superfoods across the globe, and feeling anxious in the grocery aisle, while the underlying power structures have not budged. So, information is a starting point, but it is not a strategy.
That's another one by you. So what about the strategy of local food? You know, in your story, this kind of was one of the motivating forces for you. This is an enduring turn for localism, know your farmer, CSAs, connecting with your landscape terroir. The idea here that shortening the supply chain that creates kind of economic, ecological alternatives to all the middlemen that is consistent with the status quo.
Yeah, there's real value there. The local food can keep money circulating regionally, strengthen relationships, and build food sovereignty. But localism without land and infrastructure is super fragile. Can't build a resilient regional food system if farmers don't have secure access to land or affordable housing, processing facilities, storage, and distribution. Because too often local food becomes a boutique layer on top of inequitable land system. Farmers are still pushed to the margins, geographically and economically, while consumers in cities get the aesthetic of connection. So I think we need to be honest that the US diet is deeply global. Coffee, spices, rice. Localizing here doesn't absolve us of responsibility elsewhere.
What about some new embraces of the techno fix? So we hear about precision agriculture, climate smart seeds, even lab grown proteins. These ideas kind of solve the politics problem. We don't need any of this global solidarity because we have the power of innovation. Why not treat the food system more like, I don't know, an iPhone?
Well, food isn't a software and land isn't an app. Right? Like, I mean, yeah, okay. Technology can absolutely help with better tools, better data, better practices, but techno fixes usually leave ownership untouched. Not only of like who owns the land, but who owns the data, who owns the patents, right? So when solutions are proprietary and capital intensive, they tend to concentrate power. They don't democratize it, and they often assume that farmers are the problem to be optimized rather than people navigating structural constraints. So you can't code your way around land inequality.
There is something new, though, that I want to ask you about, which is a new individualist turn, perhaps. It's the Maha logic. It's a growing movement with health maybe at the center, or clean bodies, aversion to toxins, diet as the pathway out of crisis. I don't really like where it's coming from, but anytime an idea wins cross coalitions, buy-in, I do pay attention at least.
Yeah, and because what's tricky with Maha is that it does get some things right. Chronic disease is real, environmental toxins are real, and the food system is making people sick. But like the proposed solution often lands back on personal responsibility. Eat better, live cleaner, opt out, burn it down. Like that framing ignores the fact that most people don't control the land their food comes from, the conditions they work under, or the policies shaping their environment. So without a structural analysis, Maha becomes another version of wellness culture where health is something you earn through discipline and purchasing power rather than something we build collectively.
Let me run one more grand theory of change in the food system by you. So, this is my personal favorite. I wrote my dissertation about it, and that's the idea that kind of a new generation of farmers, simply through pure demographics. We have these aging farmers, and the new farmers, they know about climate change now, and simply when they replace the old guard, as long as we, help them on their way with training, they're going to fix things because once they gain access to that land, then their better values will change the practices.
Yeah, give me all your land. I mean, sure, I love that idea. I love young farmers. I am one. But yeah, land doesn't magically transfer with enlightenment. Farmland is expensive, ownership is concentrated, and without land reform, new farmers are locked into insecure leases, crushing debt, or total exclusion. So yeah, demographics don't change power on their own, but policy does.
Across these ideas of kind of fixing the food system, the good food movement, is there a main flaw that these have in common? What's the main flaw here that they're missing?
Yeah, I mean, well, they work around land instead of through it. They ask consumers, entrepreneurs, technologies, or individual farmers to solve problems that are fundamentally about ownership, governance, and history. So until we deal with land, who owns it, how it's governed, how it's transferred, we'll keep cycling through clever fixes that feel good and fall short.
I mean, I obviously agree with you here. The show is landscapes, but kind of hearing someone else say it sounds like a tall order. Like images of land reform, they evoke moments of dispossession in history, political upheaval, and this is a call for something, even through the policy work that you've been doing, outside of the current arena of politics, it seems to me at least. And so, even my radical property scholar friends, they write like many articles about legal cases where someone was finally able to gain access to walk the beach in front of a secluded mansion. Like that's progress in the legal world. I mean, is this possible at all?
Well, if it has to be done through something radical, then it simply must be done, right? I, I don't mean to sound cavalier about it, especially coming from, my Vietnamese background and my family's personal experience of like the violence of land reform. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be easy, but I do believe that we have like the tools, the lessons to learn from to do things better, to do things more peacefully, and the creativity to make a new way forward. And we have to start by committing ourselves to it.
I think that's a great place to think together on how we should do that.
Yeah. Well, let's keep talking about it. Bring snacks and a land reform agenda.
Coming soon on Landscapes, Mai and I will build on the idea that a modern day land reform agenda needs to be built if our best ideas about sustainable food might have a chance at succeeding. Land reform is, of course, not a whole solution for what ails the food system. But I think what Mai and I agree on is that it is a key overlooked piece of the puzzle, and that because of how entrenched our laws and social norms around land tend to be, it doesn't seem like a variable that can change at all. This is why most of the food system solutions we have are built on top of dominant land relations and property systems, and that is why they tend to fail. But we need to explore this further. In coming episodes, Mai and I will test these ideas. Is this a question of simply figuring out how to redistribute land in a more just way? If that's the case, then who gets the land and how ought we decide? Or does property possess an original sin that needs to be discarded and reimagined anew? How should we structure access, control, and ownership to facilitate Mai's vision of a humanized agriculture? Importantly, who's doing this work today? And what can we learn from them? Join us and spread the word about what's coming, because it all comes back to land.